For more than 60 years, the influence of the French in sub-Saharan African nations has been overwhelming, from providing military support to using a common currency amongst its colonies. France stamped its feet firmly. Now, times, however, may be changing, with the French forces on Operation Barkhane and Takuba now preparing to leave Mali amid a widespread call from the Malian locals for the exit of France. The times are now different. Now, the locals who welcomed the French forces with ecstasy 9 years ago also loud in their chants for the exit of France. Still riddled in security upheavals and now controlled by the military, what does the exit of France mean to Mali and the future of the Francafrique? Welcome to Village Square Africa here on News Central Television. I'm Sulaiman. Now, following the exit of France from Mali, as relationships between both countries grew strained after the military takeover in the West African nation, there are suggestions that it may be the beginning of the end of Francafrique. Since the emergence of the Semi-Goïta-led new military government in Mali, there's been a review of the relationship between both nations. The first move made by Mali in its bid to cut ties with France is ending an almost decade-long military relationship. It has found new friends in Russia, and the economic relationship between both nations also appears to face a downturn. While Mali is changing its trajectory from France and seeking new partners in its international relationship, Niger is entering the fray. At the EU-AU summit in Brussels on Thursday, the president of Niger Republic, Mohamed Bazoum, met France's Macron as both nations struck a new relationship. Now, the future of this is already in doubt, as the Nigerian locals have criticized the move. Now, a few months ago, Nigerians trooped to the street to seek the exit of France from their country. As French influence in Africa keeps reducing, it leaves an opportunity for a redirection of fostering better unity amongst African states. The big question is, will this happen anytime soon? Joining me to talk about some of the key things, Kabir Adamu, security analyst, and Vincent Obisie-Orlu, a researcher with Good Governance Africa. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Let's start with you, Kabir. You've seen this latest development at the start of that meeting, a lot of, perhaps leading to that EU-AU meeting, a lot of people quite didn't see this happening. I don't know for you, did you see France leaving Mali?
Thank you, Sulaiman, and nice to be here again. Yes, the writing was on the wall for quite a while, actually. The fact that France's investment, I'm using this word now loosely, in Africa since 2013 in the form of deployment of about 5,000 troops has not succeeded in addressing the key challenge that the region was facing, which is mainly terrorism, and the fact that its political objective, which is to entrench democracy, was not being achieved. Mali, in particular, had experienced almost about 3 military coups in a space of about three years, despite this huge investment of France in the country. And then, more importantly, its popularity among the citizens of the countries in the Sahel was deteriorating at a rate that was really alarming. Protests were being organized in virtually all the countries in the Sahel. We saw that in Niger, we saw it in Mali, we saw it in Burkina Faso. So that, and then of course with the policy pronouncement by Macron that he's going to exit, at least reduce the troop strength in the Sahel. That didn't come to me as a surprise, especially after the military junta in Mali had indicated that the transition process that the both African countries and the international community had agreed to would be shifted by almost 5 years. So clearly, France was not left with any choice but to maintain a position that would show its displeasure with this military junta. The other element is the move by the junta to form some form of partnership and agreement with Russia that led to the deployment of the Wagner force in Mali. That too was another stumbling block to an improved relationship between Mali and France. So all of these were indications that the relationship had reached a deterioration that would mean any number of things, including the exit of France and from Mali, as it were.
All right, okay. Vincent, once again, thanks for your time. And quickly, what does this exit mean to Francafrique, France leaving Mali?
Thank you for having me. In terms of Francafrique, I think what this means really is that there's a lot of displeasure particularly within the West African region, for France's involvement in the region, how France has involved itself. I think in terms of Francafrique on the broader continent, we aren't so much seeing as much of a reaction or a lashback. For example, in DRC and Central African Republic, we aren't seeing the levels of discontent with France and its presence there as we are seeing in West Africa. However, this all comes at a time when African countries are reevaluating the way in which they relate with the European Union, and France especially as a major player on the continent. Within the West African region, France has always had a significant role. For example, the Central African franc is the currency for many Central African countries, in which they are in a union, a monetary union together, in which the currency is pegged to the euro, and half of the reserves were until recently controlled and kept in France. Now, as you can see, France has a significant role in Africa, both trade-wise and politically. But we are seeing, I think we can say that we're seeing within West Africa a shift, a gradual shift and reduction of the significance of the role that France plays.
Okay, Kabir, quickly here, because there seemed to be some kind of urgency. Mali wants France to leave almost immediately. What does this mean, security-wise?
So again, I think there's some form of posturing by both sides. France did its posturing and said it was going to leave, and then the military junta, being what it is, has responded by asking them to leave immediately. I don't see that is realistic. It's not likely that, given the logistical requirement for such a movement, that departure would be immediate. What, however, it sends, it's de-escalation of the diplomatic relationship between the two sides. Now, having established that, the consequence of that French statement, we have seen how other allies, especially the European member countries that are grouped under Operation Takuba, 14 of them have, one after the other, indicated that they would also withdraw if France withdraws. Now, what remains to be seen is how that gap is going to be filled. There are roughly around 4 concrete arrangements, multilateral or international arrangements, that are currently in Mali. The UN mission, then about 2 arrangements by the EU, and then of course Operation Barkhane by France. Now, if 3 of these arrangements are collapsing, and I say this with all, loosely, if France is leading those arrangements and France is leading, then the European countries follow suit. Then it means 3 of those arrangements are collapsing. That will be left with the UN mission. Now, will the UN mission be able to fill the gap that will be created by the departure of these 3 other arrangements? And mind you, these 3 other arrangements include both the military component, which is the Operation Barkhane, and then training component, as well as 8 under the 2 EU arrangements. Now, there in no way would one assume that the UN can fill that gap. So that gives room for other world players, such as Russia. However, if we go by the antecedents of Russia in other parts of the continent, then it's not likely that they are going to feel, in fact, given their democratic antecedents, it's not likely that they would enhance good governance, which is at the center of all of the crises in Mali, especially the socioeconomic component. So to answer your question directly, the gap would be created, and that gap is going to most likely worsen the socioeconomic circumstances in Mali that provides the drivers of insecurity, including terrorism and the several other security challenges that Mali is facing. So suffice to say that a big gap would be created, and it's not likely that that gap would be filled any moment, in the near future.
So in other words, let me stay with you a bit, Kabir, before I come back to Vincent, because listening to you, you're talking about the gap. In other words, this isn't the right time to see France exit the country, bearing in mind the insurgency and terrorism in that country.
I liken it to a catch-22 situation. France has been deployed in Mali since 2013. Unfortunately, however, that deployment for that long has not resulted in any meaningful impact. Yes, it was able to push back both the terrorists and then the Tuareg rebels. But then, the reality is that the Malian government is not in control of any of the entirety of its territory, despite its French presence. And then, of course, a significant number of Malians are being killed, despite the presence of French troops in Mali. And we've spoken about the dissent that has led to from the local populace. So with all of that in mind, what new strategy would France kind of bring in? And that's what we are not hearing. All we're hearing is that it's going to relocate possibly to Niger, but how would its counterterrorism strategy change to lead to an improvement in its presence in the Sahel that would now help the Sahelian countries? We're not hearing any of that. If we liken it to the situation in Nigeria, the over-concentration and the military component of this counterterrorism strategy, I think, is what got France to where it is. The other components, including, how to address climate change, how to address the consequence of bad governance, and then the inability to, bring people together, has led us to where we are. And unfortunately, neither France or any of the other elements that are deployed there are speaking about these components, especially these drivers of extremism and terrorism in the Sahel.
Let me bring in Vincent, and going by some of the key points raised by Kabir, talking about the trade, social, economic drivers, and the gap that this may create. How will you, rate France's relationship with African countries? Is it something that has been mutually beneficial to these countries?
So, how far are we looking back? France's relationship with African countries has in many ways been very directly linked to its colonial history with these African countries. On one hand, we're looking at a France that has, to some degree, recreated certain elements of colonial control. Ivory Coast, for example, France has a huge control in the country in terms of industry, in terms of the ways in which projects are done. France's relationship with African countries has not always been mutually beneficial. Saying otherwise would be lying to ourselves. There is a need for a significant improvement in the way in which France relates with African countries. And I think that in the recent AU-EU summit that just occurred, there should be a shift towards dialogue in which, as well as not just dialogue, but also implementation of ways in which France and Africa can actually come together and cooperate on a more equal footing. The question of whether France will be willing, how willing France is to give up the levels of control and power and dominance it has on the continent is another question. The previous show on this channel, the guest was speaking about how Europe and France have generally not looked at Africa in a win-win, mutually beneficial manner in terms of how agreements occur. There's still colonial hangovers in many of the agreements and ways in which France and the continent relate. However, we can say that in the last several years, there has been some minimal shifts towards a more mutually beneficial form of relationship. But that is not enough. More needs to be done. To go back to Kabir's point about questions about governance, these questions of governance are directly linked to the ways in which the colonial hangovers occur. How is the money from aid and as well as sponsorship and funding for projects, how does that benefit the people? How much oversight is there? Are we just having French presence as a military occupation of sorts, or are we actually having the French participate and act as a partner in development projects? In an article in the CBC, Don Murray stated that France is losing the great game in West Africa. And one of the reasons for this that we can point to is the fact that there are other players there are other players that are there, bringing in and coming in to say, we can offer you something different. We don't have the same history that France has with you or that Britain has with you. We can offer you something different, something better. We're talking about the Chinas, we're talking about the Russias. And it's really important that these new groups and new countries that are coming into the fray on the African continent are kept in mind and are acknowledged as new role players and actors. And France, as a more mature and has been in Africa, and there's a long history of French presence in Africa, needs to really start to reevaluate the way it's going to deal and interact with African countries. Otherwise, I feel and I fear that what we're seeing currently in Mali, in Burkina Faso, could potentially spread to other West African countries in which there's criticism. Already seen sparks of it in Niger, in which the French force has moved and migrated to in the aftermath of the Malian junta saying that please leave. So it's important that France, to maintain and get its prospects and outcomes done, needs to have a redefinition and a analysis of how it relates with the continent.
You know, Vincent, listening to you, you started by saying France's relationship hasn't been mutually beneficial to some of these African countries. Let's quickly ask, is it safe to say that there are lessons now learned, by France, looking at the arms wide open it is getting from Niger?
There are lessons that should be learned.
That should be learned.
We don't know if France is learning those lessons or not, but there are lessons that should be learned. Now, Niger arms wide opening to France, we're seeing this as more of Niger is trying to maintain its security in the Sahel region, as opposed to a free invitation to France to just come through and stay here.
So, Kabir, many French colonies, in sub-Saharan Africa have a sense of subservience to France. And you can tell is the genesis of the anger from the locals when you see all the anger out there on the streets. How can France, listening to Vincent now, so that because he's also said something that this just might spread from Mali to Burkina Faso. So how can France improve these ties to see that, lessons have been learned?
Well, great question, Sulaiman. First off, even in Niger, there is significant resentment to the decision by the Nigerian president to allow France to relocate, as it were, to the border area between Mali and France. The discussion is currently ongoing, and part of what a significant portion of the Nigerian population are saying is that that issue was not discussed at Parliament, and that the president does not have a constitutional right to take such a decision without seeking the input or consent of the Parliament. So even though, you're right, the quote-unquote subservience that we've seen from former French colonies would mean that eventually that dissent would probably fiddle away, as long as there is something on the table for Niger to take away. And just like Vincent has rightly put it, the key driver for the Nigerian consent is how their security will be improved. It's a fact that the border area between Niger and Mali is significantly porous, and terrorist groups are able to crisscross. The gun running, the drug trafficking channels pass through that border. And so any support that an European power like France can give to strengthen that corridor would be welcomed by Niger and most likely by the West African sub-region, especially the Sahelian countries. Now, in response to your question about what France can do, again, the France's involvement, I think, is driven by two interests. Its political interest and then its economic interest. Now, perhaps there is a need to add a third interest, which is the interest of the local populations. And we spoke about good governance. So perhaps democracy, which is the political interest that is the obvious involvement of France in those countries to foster democracy. What kind of democracy would lead to good governance? Is it the French style of democracy? Is it the American? Or should there be a democratic system that is peculiar to the African continent, that does not allow sit-tight rulers, and that does not allow the kind of situation where a lot of persons are questioning France's credentials? On the one hand, it is supporting a military change of government in Chad, and then on the other hand, it is opposing the same change of government in Burkina Faso and in Mali. So I think those are the key issues that would need to be addressed as France evolves how to meander around these new issues that have arisen in terms of its relationship. Anything short of that would further worsen the circumstances in the Sahel, and that would have a direct impact on the security of Europe in terms of the number of extremists that would be targeting and migrating to Europe, in terms of the number of Africans that would be attempting to migrate to Europe. And of course, the socio-economic conditions of these African countries would also drive all of these things that I've mentioned. So again, there is a need for a change in tact, and perhaps to include a third interest and objective for France's involvement in Africa.
Vincent, we'll come back to talk about opportunities, but quickly here, for some others, they've argued that it looks like, a fight to gain freedom from colonialism. So is it safe to say these African countries were not truly independent, as it were?
Well, it's if we're looking at fights to gain independence, it's a bit late in the game, as a mentor of mine would say, to be saying that that these African countries are not independent. They might not have fully gained their independence in terms of national security issues, removing France from the equation in terms of how they manage and maintain their borders. But they have been politically independent in many ways. Now, what these countries, what we're seeing to some degree, especially in the case of Mali, is what I suspect is a narrative that the military government is pushing as a way to gain legitimacy and claim that its actions are in the interests of, increasing independence and regaining independence. And that's a language that's very that's very easy for people on the ground to go into and accept and embrace, because there has not been the benefits of French security in the region or French action in the region that were promised. And so the French are seen as an occupier to some degree, and not in equal, and with their unequal partnerships, they're not seen as someone who is supporting, assisting. They're rather seen as someone who is, by the local population, as someone who is controlling and managing, directing, channeling. Yes, these countries have been independent for more than 40 years in most cases. They have not fully managed to gain all aspects of their independence in terms of financial, as seen by this, the CFA zone, the Centrafrique franc, So that independence in terms of the currency system, the financial independence, is something that has been a process that's ongoing. The ECHO is something that I think will, if it can get off the ground, will in many ways really push further independence. I think what these countries should be saying is that we are independent. However, the level of independence, the level of management and oversight that France is having needs to be reduced. France needs to shift away from monitoring us as if we were still somewhat under their control, and look at us as equal partners to be managed and rather engaged with, as opposed to managed.
Well, Kabir, before we go on the break, quickly here, a lot of people had thought or had argued that the world today, especially coming to your area of forte security, is a world of partnerships, cooperation. So if France is leaving, the big question will be what opportunities are there for African countries if they all manage to see France leave their countries? Are they capable of facing the security challenges all alone?
The simple answer is no, unfortunately. The capability of the military, their capacity, as well as the other security organizations, is not sufficient to manage the security challenges in the region. And so there is a need for partnership, but partnership of the type that Vincent has described, a partnership that is mutually beneficial, a partnership among equals, if that's possible, given the circumstances of African countries, and a partnership that has sustainability, behind its evolvement. Now, like I mentioned earlier on, we have a significant UN deployment, even though the mandate of that deployment is slightly different from the mandate of the French deployment. 13,000 troops, almost double or triple even the size of the Operation Barkhane, as well as about 2,000 policemen. And that's fairly significant. So that's one area that the UN can look at. How does it change the mandate of that deployment to cover the gaps that will be created? But more importantly, and this is where I stand, African countries must seek to develop their own capacities. In international politics, what determines each side's engagement is its interests. Now, we cannot, as it were, leave France or Europe and then go to Russia or even China, which is what some experts are recommending or considering. It would just be another cycle of exploitation. So the bottom line is, how do African countries develop their expertise and their capacity to address this? And we can't shy away from it. We've mentioned it before. I'm still going to mention it. There is nothing but good governance, a governance system that would listen to the requirements and desire.
Well, there seems to be a glitch.
Respond to these desires and wants in a manner that meets.
No, I lost you for a bit, but you're back. But it's a good point for us to go on the break. When we come back, we'll talk more about the issues, especially around the Sahel, like Mali, Burkina Faso, all trying to sever ties from France, and what that will mean for security and commerce for the people. That's when we return. All of you just joined us, you're watching VSA here on News Center Television, looking at developments in Mali. Like that country, Burkina Faso is also severing ties with France as citizens desire a new direction. A re-evaluation of existing agreements between France and African countries is of utmost necessity. The travels and imprints of the French colonial past are still very much conspicuous in these countries. New generations are calling for a turnaround in fortunes in their countries, and this looks to begin with cutting ties that are deemed not mutually beneficial. So with me is Kabir, Adamu, and Vincent Obisie-Orlu. Let's start with you, Vincent. How can African countries begin to depend less on Europe?
That's the question that's really interesting. How can African countries begin to depend less on Europe? Well, African countries could first start to really work together, further the integration project on the continent. That's one thing that really needs to be done. The management and free movement of resources, goods, services, materials, resources. This is important for the development and expansion of inter-African trade. Now, if African countries can increase the level of trade they have within themselves to a point where it dwarfs the amount that it is with Europe, this is a huge boost to an inter-Africa, a stronger Africa, a more resilient Africa. Now, there's also the question of security questions and security ties. ECOWAS could, within this region, take up more of the responsibility in terms of the management of security situations in the Sahel. I know that my compatriots have said that there's a lack of skill and capacity in Africa for managing these issues. However, I think that while there's a role for the European countries and actors to play, there is a great need for African countries to really take control and take authority of how they manage the security situation. Yes, does this maybe mean that ECOWAS would need to reevaluate the way in which its mandate is? Perhaps. But there's an important question of security in Africa should have greater role for African countries to play and manage their own security. Kabir mentioned the international system. And having a situation where your military, the protection of your borders, is managed by external powers is an infringement on your sovereignty. And sovereignty is the highest idea and ideal within the international system. Sovereign countries are not controllable by other countries. And we're seeing African countries engaging with these unfair treaties and unfair agreements with France and other European powers. They are in a very weird quasi-sovereign position. And so it's important for African countries, while still engaging, maintaining close ties, and look, telling African countries to cut all ties to Europe is not a great idea. I don't think removing and isolating Africa from the world is ever going to be a good plan. But increasing the way and the role in which Africa has for managing and handling some of its issues is really important.
Well, Kabir, looks at the end of the day, we're all on the same page. This is something that still falls back to partnership, cooperation, and it's amazing that the leaders are not seeing it that way. France is still one of the biggest foreign supporters of the many African countries. But again, what does this renewed desire to see it leave mean to the future of African countries, especially in the face of the leadership gap?
I think it sends a very strong message to the Western world, as it were, despite the failings of the African continent. And we must acknowledge these failings. It is the failings in the first place that allowed, these powers to come and dominate and exercise the types of authority that they're exercising, and with the kind of impunity that we're seeing. But despite that, it sends the message that power still resides with the people. That even where you excuse failure by governments because you are getting some advantages, and we must speak about this. Despite France's outward position on certain things, it still allows some of these African leaders to take their ill-gotten wealth, buy property in France. It still allows them to go on medical trips. It still allows them to, exercise some kind of largesse in France. So this and all of that is not hidden to the citizens of this country. But on top of all of it is the failures that have allowed a continuation of the security challenges. Now, that is in no way absolving the African governments of responsibility. But if, like Vincent said, you can let go of a certain aspect of your sovereignty to another country, and yet that country is not seen to demonstrate a sense of responsibility towards preventing the kind of challenges that you're having in country, then the natural consequence is the type of dissent that we're seeing. So I'm hoping that that is the lesson that will emerge from all of this, that yes, you can have your way for a long time, but eventually the power of the people would speak up and would see it happening. So hopefully that would help shape future relationships between African countries and Western.
Let me stay with you for a bit before we go back to Vincent. And it's about history, going back in time. And we all recall in history classes, for those who went to school on the continent, how Europe petitioned Africa, the Scramble for Africa. Is that happening again? Because now we're talking about new entrants, the Chinese, the Russians, and even the French. They're still very much around, even though they're about to leave Mali. Kabir.
In a way, yes. The French is leaving Mali. Well, may leave Mali. I still emphasize that word may. If you are in the kind of field...
You're still very skeptical about that.
Yes, I am. And for the simple reason that my background is risk management and intelligence. And I can tell you that given the significant assets that France have in the region, depending on how they want to play it out, they have the capacity to change the story, the outcome of all of this. So a lot of things may play out, but let's leave it at that. Now their relocation, as it were, to Niger does not remove them from the picture completely. All it does is to take them to another environment. And in fact, the long run plan, from what we're hearing, is for them to leave, to redeploy to the coastal parts of Africa, especially places like Cote d'Ivoire, Togo, and several other countries where we've already seen an emergence of some of these terrorist groups. So clearly, the foreign policy objective of France vis-a-vis its relationship with Africa is changing. The question, and this is for me the million-dollar question, how is Africa, especially AU and ECOWAS and the other regional bodies, either responding or even taking measures in advance to counter some of these changes and put forward their interest? Yes, we can point at the developments within the economic sphere, such as the African Free Trade Agreement. What steps is being taken by AU and these other regional bodies to see how African countries can come together? Because at the center of all of this is the economy. If African countries can take charge of their economy, and I'm very happy Vincent has given some background to how tight some of these former African countries are to France, which makes any move by them that would anger France to be, for lack of a better word, suicidal, because their economy is tied to the French government, as it were, and so there is a limit to which they can show dissent to the French government. So a lot of this will have to play out in terms of what kind of policies the multilateral bodies such as EU and the other regional bodies put forward, and at the national level, the governments put in place. If we pick security where, it's my field, I'm not too convinced that the African continent and African countries are ready to take up that responsibility. We have several policies at both the multilateral and at national levels that are yet to be implemented and that are frankly relying on the largesse of countries like France. If you pick the G5 as an example, G5 cannot exist without the involvement of France. And now that Mali is technically out of G5, or at least until there is a restoration of democratic governance in Mali, then the future of even G5 questioned. And so the platform for countering terrorism in Sahel is likely to be non-existent. Now, can Niger, with all its challenges, be able to play that role and take up that responsibility? I doubt.
Well, Vincent, quickly here, Africa needs to stand alone. Listening to both of you, it comes back to the leadership issue, the control of the resources. But the continent, again, these leaders still run to France and others at the slightest of discomfort. Now, do you think African countries are really ready for these big moves?
Right. So at Good Governance Africa, we define good governance as the authoritative allocation of resources, the authoritative and efficient and effective allocation of resources. Who gets what, when, where, how, and why. Now, African countries need to move forward into a way in which these resources are being allocated in an authoritative and effective manner. There's transparency. The lack of transparency on the African continent with regards to how resources are allocated leads and opens room for many of these fights and problems and challenges, which Kabir has mentioned. As he said, it all comes back to governance. And as I've said many times before here, it all comes back to the economy. And the question of how the economy is and how the economy works for people is very important. Now, with regards to can African governments and leaders take that reign, African governments and leaders need to be open to they need to be open to be more transparent. Now, many African leaders will not voluntarily, perhaps, be willing and transparent in some regions in Western Africa. Nigeria, for example, has its own issues and challenges with questions around corruption, questions around transparency. Ivory Coast has the challenge of where the heads of state have been challenged of having extended and used unconstitutional means to extend their terms within a constitutional framework. International and regional bodies have picked and chosen which issues and situations they'll say label as unconstitutional and which they'll label as acceptable. This is important. Look, African people in a article written by a colleague of mine, he said that Africans are not rejecting democracy. Africans still have a passion for democracy. There is still a desire for regular elections on the continent. All that needs to be done really is there needs to be more from African leaders to inspire confidence that these structures are working. And if we do not have a population that is inspired and trusts or believes in the structures of democracy and democratic governments, you cannot say that African leaders are taking authority and taking control. This control and authority remains something that's nebulous and anyone can contest, right? We can have a situation where in the Sahel, your Group A is looking to secede from the country to say, we want greater rights for us because you can't provide security in light of the situation of climate change and how that's affecting us and bringing pastoralists into conflict with farmers. So the question of governance is central to this. And I think until such a time that African leaders can really effectively evaluate and reevaluate the question and issue of governance and how they intend to make governance happen, we're going to stay in this situation.
And Kabir, listening to Vincent, it comes back to you. It looks to me that you have a whole lot that you're dealing with on the continent to seeing how peace can be restored to the continent because of the lack of good leadership. Kabir.
That's unfortunately the fact of the matter. And it worries me that every time, African leaders meet and even the world meets, that issue is rarely, discussed. Yes, people can point a finger to the peer review mechanism, but how effective has that peer review mechanism been in terms of improving good governance? There is no country really that we've seen any changes as a result of this peer review mechanisms. So again, like a lot of things in Africa, I think the objective is noble, but unfortunately the application of it has not resulted in the kinds of hope and anticipation that were associated when the peer review mechanism was introduced. So I think there is a need for another platform, another strategy for self-evaluation and for enhancing good governance within the continent. Otherwise, the future, unfortunately, is looking very bleak for the Sahel and for the continent as a whole.
And Kabir, sorry, this is also to you. I'll come back to Vincent quickly. Do you think the people out there on the streets of these countries also understand the import of what this means? I mean, it was only recently some of these citizens were seen, waving flags of other countries, for instance, like that of Russia.
Yes, definitely. And the reason why I say this is because there is a direct correlation, really, between their situation, as it were, and the kind of governance. Why are they supportive of a military, coup? They are supportive of a military coup because they understand that the previous democratic governments that were in place were unable to address the core challenges affecting the country. Unfortunately, however, I think in that desire, they have failed to realize that the consequences of military takeover is usually going to set the country several years behind, mainly because of the repression associated with military regimes. Sometimes, although that's not necessarily correct. So a lot would depend on how this military junta manages the situation and how it's able to address the challenges facing the country. Unfortunately, even though I hate to say this, the military junta has found itself in a very difficult situation. Virtually all the likely partners have placed some form of embargo or ban on it. And so it's been forced to look at a very unlikely partner, which is Russia. And so that is also going to create another consequence and probably make it a pariah state within that context. And so that aspiration that has led the people to support this military junta is going to be defeated as quickly as it came, because the desire, no matter how genuine that desire is by the junta, it's not likely to be achieved because of these challenges that I've mentioned.
And Vincent, the AU must not be left out of this. The African Union hasn't actually been able to show some form of bite, some form of force, and to rein in some kind of order amongst member states. How can that, be well managed by that union? It's believed that this may be, if it is believed that this may be freedom for Africa, or the freedom that Africa really needs, can the AU, because Kabir used that phrase, peer review mechanism, which we haven't actually seen amongst the African countries, African leaders. What's the place of leadership here? We go back to leadership.
The peer review mechanism on the continent has not always been effective in terms of how it works and operates. In many ways, you're having different heads of states reviewing and evaluating each other. I don't see some of these heads of state calling out the way in which head of state A is doing things, because head of state B might be looking to see how they can pull this off in their own country. So the African Union is really not playing as much of a role, or rather, it's not playing the ideal role that we'd want it to play. It is playing a role, it is trying. It has suspended these countries, and has tried to level sanctions against them. But there is more that needs to be done in terms of really engaging, speaking with, as unpalatable as this might seem, there's a need to speak and communicate with these juntas and military governments and dictatorships, as well as understand what's happening on the ground with regard to the people. Why are the people in both Mali and Burkina Faso somewhat in support of these military juntas? Why is that? That's an important question that needs to be asked and questioned and critiqued and evaluated. There is no peer review mechanism that looks and goes down to the civilian and population level. The peer review mechanism stays at the head of state level. And there's a need for an understanding of what is going on in the civilians and the citizens' day-to-day life. Now, Kabir's mentioned that Mali is being pushed into the arms of Russia. I think in terms of the military junta is being pushed into the arms of Russia to have some legitimacy has been a hard spot. I think that the military junta in Mali has also looked to see how it can use sanctions and all of these different efforts from the international community, as well as regional bodies and actors, as a way to increase their legitimacy and present a narrative that these people are against us. We are trying to chart a new trajectory on the continent for ourselves. These people are against us. Come join us and support us as we go on this new journey against all of these people. We're on our own, on a new frontier. And it's a very seductive framework and framing for people to hear. You're on your own new journey, you're on your own new adventure. How long it'll last, they'll be able to maintain and manage this with issues such as inflation and these challenges, I don't know. You can also see some of the African Union struggle to manage things in that ECOWAS placed sanctions on Mali. Some of these sanctions aren't working effectively. Remember, Mauritania in the north is not a member of ECOWAS. So Mauritania is still having trade with Mali. And you know, what has the African Union done? Or rather, how will the African Union take a step further to engage and put pressure and engage with the junta? Has the African Union actually had any dialogue with these people? And to what degree has the outcome been? These are things that are very important to happen and need to occur, as unpalatable as they might seem, in order to improve or make progress in the situation in Mali.
Well, I think at the end of the day, the regional blocs really must show some bite and see how this can be salvaged. It looks like some ticking time bomb, as it were. But I think we've reached the anchor point here. Many thanks for being such a nice company, Kabir, Adamu, and Vincent, Obisie-Orlu. And we'll be back on this to our viewers. Many thanks for watching. I'm Sulaiman.
Thank you, Sulaiman.